How do you find Uber before it's Uber? How do you find Airbnb before it's Airbnb? I really wanted to get a job at Venture. I remember at the time calling an alumni from Middlebury where I went to school, and I was like, how do we get in front of this founder investor audience that you've created? And so let's just throw an event and see what happens. And there was a line around the block. And I was like, oh my God, this is it. One number means nothing on a newsletter, but one person physically present is a whole lot more. And I remember them being like, we love this. Like, we're all networking in line. This is great. My mom came to this event. And after she came to that event, she sort of looked at me and she was like, I don't know what you're doing, but keep doing it.
All right, Louis, it's been a minute, but we are back with another Letterland podcast. And I'm very excited today because we have a good friend of mine and somebody who's been in the business for a while, despite his young age, Brett Perlmutter. The best way I can explain Brett to you, Louis, is he's the kind of guy that makes you feel bad about what you were doing soon after college and like for your first job. Like I was just fucking around for a while and this guy was just building this incredible business. And I'll just get all of the the love fest out of the way at the beginning. But I think when I was at Barstool, he was the only person that I ever said, like, we need to hire him. And as you'll see, it probably doesn't make any sense for him to work at Barstool, but I was just like, we just need this guy on the team. So Brett's story is pretty awesome, and I'll let him fill in the blanks. But just so you know, Louis and everybody at home, he built something called Bullet Pitch, right? So started out as a newsletter that I believe when he was at Middlebury College, he built this out basically telling VCs about companies that were cool that might not be on their radar. And the entire goal of it was to get on VC's radar so that he could get a job, in venture capital. And that ended up exploding into this huge thing where the newsletter exploded. It ended up becoming an events business. Now he's running a fund. He's all over the podcast circuit. This guy is just incredibly successul for being, I don't know, how old are you? 20, 22, 23?
25.
Okay. You're finally 25. So you can finally rent a car now. But did I get that mostly right, Brett?
Yeah, 100%. Let me fill in some sort of the blanks here. But yeah, I mean, you did. I started it while I was in my dorm room. The sort of thesis behind Bullet Pitch initially, and it's funny because normally I don't start here, but you brought it up, so I'm going to start here, which is I really wanted to get a job at Venture. And I remember at the time calling an alumni from Middlebury where I went to school, and I was like, hey, how do I get a job in Venture? Like, what do I do? How did you do it? And I remember him saying to me something along the lines of like, it's funny, what I used to do is I used to find really great deals, which I was like, how do you do that? And send them to other venture firms. And I remember getting off the call thinking more like an entrepreneur than probably an investor, which has definitely been the through line of my short but sort of packed career so far. And I remember saying to him, like, I remember saying to myself, well, why wouldn't you just send it to all investors at once? Because if all investors are looking for great companies, why would I not just like BCC them on an email and come up with some really creative format to sort of hook them all in? So you're right. I started Bullet Pitch because I really wanted to get a job in venture. What quickly happened thereafter was as we sort of started scaling it, and I think, we can sort of get into how I did scale it. But as it started scaling, what became really interesting was at first almost was like, okay, I'm doing this for me, but I quickly realized how much value I was adding to investors who, think about it, had looked at Forbes, Fortune, TechCrunch, all these media companies that have covered companies that have already raised. And we said, well, let's be the de facto sort of media company newsletter to cover startups that haven't yet raised. And so there was an immediate value add on sort of the investor side. But then what became really interesting, and this was sort of the great unlock for me, was venture capital is all about access, right? How do you get access to the hottest deal? How do you find Uber before it's Uber? How do you find Airbnb before it's Airbnb? What became really interesting was I started to get these founders coming to me being like, how do I get my company featured in this? Right. And then similarly, I started getting these advertisers coming to us being like, how do we get in front of this founder investor audience that you've created? And so it became sort of this value add on all three sides. We're sponsors, obviously, but then investors were reading it because they wanted to do the deals, and founders were reading it because they wanted their deal to be featured. And very quickly, as this thing started to explode, it became not just, well, how do I feature the next great deal, but oh my God, investors are putting their real money into these companies. All these founders want to be a part of this. And so from there, and again, it can get into more of this, but scaled sort of an events arm on top of it, right? Investors and founders want to meet. what better way to bring them together than through an event, which if we have all of their attention, we can do that. Okay, well, this is really interesting. Now that we have so much deal flow and access, maybe we should think about investing in the deals. And so we started doing that. And then sort of more recently, and Tyler, I know maybe we'll say this for the end, but you and I haven't even really caught up about this recently. We're starting to work with a lot of content creators right now because the thesis is, well, if we've done such a good job with this media company, giving ourselves distribution and access to really good flow and de-risking ourselves to find the best deals, why not de-risk the companies too and start working with content creators who could become almost their in-house marketer? So we can get to all of that, but it's been really cool. But although it sounds like a lot of sort of different pieces and I can dig into every one, the through line here is that the thesis that I've been running with now for the last almost 4 years is that the future of venture and sort of business innovation is all centered around media, right? And if you can build an audience, whether you're an early stage founder, whether you're an early stage venture firm, you have an unfair advantage because all these companies now are looking for two things: capital and distribution. If you can provide both, you're an unfair sort of edge in terms of venture investing. And if you have distribution as a founder, and we've seen these really great sort of examples of founder-led marketing, you have an unfair advantage of going to get customers. And so because of that, we found ourselves in this really interesting niche. And this all started from an idea in a college dorm room.
Oh, that's awesome. And I love that story. Uh, and so you kind of just speed ran your whole, the past 5 years of your life. But can you just tell me a little bit about like how you built out the newsletter format and like why you built it out? Because I think it's
Sure.
really cool, like how it looks and like how that's changed over the years. And then I do want to get into like how the hell did you find these companies? Like you were a
Yeah.
college kid in Vermont. Like
Yeah.
how did you actually like start finding these deals?
So it's funny, right? Like it felt like it's such a big part of everything now, but it felt so simplistic at the time. And maybe it's good. And maybe this is a lesson to any founder. Don't overthink things. Like I came up with that format in probably about an hour and a half, right? It was like, I remembered, and I give credit to sort of the people who came before me, right? Like the Morning Brews of the world. And this is where we can touch on all these different newsletters and different sort of media mediums. But it was like, okay, bite-sized works. I remember I worked an internship for a podcasting business, and they had this one podcast that interviewed successful entrepreneurs. Which, by the way, half the reason I came up with Bullet Pitches because they were interviewing all these entrepreneurs who were super successful, and they kept getting all this deal flow from all these entrepreneurs that wanted to be featured on this podcast. And I was like, damn, this is pretty interesting how these two worlds interrelate. But what I remember pretty vividly was like all of the bite-sized stuff tended to work really well, where like the clips and whatnot. But this podcast was 45 minutes, and we used to watch the listenership, and it would drop off after about 10. And so I remembered sort of thinking to myself, okay, well, if I'm going to build a newsletter that is featuring an early stage company once a week, one, I'm going to only do it once a week because that's going to create sort of this like where this is our stamp of approval in the same way that like a venture firm can only back a certain amount of companies a year. But then secondarily, how are we going to do this where it feels exclusive, and how are we going to do this where it feels sort of like short and sweet and to the point? And that was where the bullet points came from. And the word bullet pitch comes from the bullet points in the newsletter. And so that was all probably spun up within an hour and change. And I remember writing the first feature January 2022. And to your question about how we sort of found the deals, at the time, I remember literally going on LinkedIn and AngelList and all of these different sort of mediums and just searching myself. And part of the reason I started Bullet Pitch, keep in mind, was because I didn't know how to find deals, right? It's like, how do you send a deal to a venture firm that you've never heard of? Well, unless you're an investor, I don't know. And so I remember that I literally, and some of it was luck too, where like, I just would find these companies. I was like, oh, that's pretty interesting. And of course I was a college kid, so no one wanted to talk to me. And so I had to write the entire first feature, or call it first 5 maybe, based on the company's website. And what was so wild was like, I would then write the feature, I would send it to the company. And I guess because early stage startups love press, and that has not changed, they thought it was sort of like a press piece. And so they started saying, hey, I'm going to promote this to our audience. Who's their audience? Well, it happens to be their investors, other founders, and anyone who's sort of close in their network. And so over the first couple of newsletters, we started to see this sort of group of people who started to subscribe who I'd never heard of, .vc, .capital, right? And all of a sudden I was like, oh, so if I like keep doing this is going to create a flywheel. And then obviously we got sort of nifty with some of the growth tricks and we're able to scale it pretty quickly. But the whole thesis became how many different venture firms can I get onto this platform and how many different founders can I get reading this thing who will then eventually apply to want to be featured themselves?
I have a bunch of questions. I guess the first one, simplest one is like, how aware were you of like other newsletters when you started this newsletter? Was this like, oh, a newsletter is just seems to be the best format for what I want to do? Or were you thinking, I want to start a newsletter, I've seen XYZ newsletter out there and I want to emulate that? What was like your like, what was your like
It,
exposure
it
to newsletters, I guess?
Great question. And the candid answer was I don't, and I think this was actually a good thing. I don't think I realized how many other newsletters were out there. I just sort of was like, this is a really good way to do it because I read the Morning Brew and I really like that one and they do it as a newsletter. And so this will be the easiest way to do it. And for some reason, it wasn't podcast, maybe because I'd had the prior sort of experience with podcasts and realized that those are really, really hard to scale. And so it was like, okay, well, I'm just going to do this as a newsletter. And at the time, like, it's funny. I remembered like being in my college gym. I swam for Middlebury and like every morning I wake up and I'd be like loading the subscribers. I'd be like, +1, yes, 10 in a day, amazing. And it was sort of like the thing where I don't think I was really aware of how big everyone else was and what everyone else was doing until obviously as things continued to scale, some of the first people I met, because this was sort of the first area that I really had access to, in addition to call it founders and investors, was all these other newsletter operators who have been doing this for years, like Tyler. And I sort of came into my first call with Tyler. I was probably sitting in my college library and talking up a big game, even though I had no idea what I was darnly doing. But to someone like Tyler, and Tyler, you could speak to this, but like it was probably a very refreshing take because I didn't think about the space in terms of the space. I just thought about what I was doing. And so as that sort of progressed though, and I think like it was right around when Beehive had come out with their feature of the cross recommendations, I started to get to meet some of these other people and I started explaining to them some of the people that we had on our list. And by that point, it was some of the people like the founders of Y Combinator and, some of these other really sort of big readers. And they were like, whoa, those people read yours newsletter? Okay, we can cross recommend even though I'm bigger than you. And so I wasn't fully aware of, I think, everything else going on in the newsletter space. And more as time has progressed. And today I can even say for a fact that like I'm super aware of what it was. And one of the reasons why I had this big realization that the newsletter itself as a business was not a sustainable one. But I think at the time I wasn't aware. And that was sort of why I was able to probably keep it afloat early, because if I knew how hard it was, I probably wouldn't have built it the way I did.
I want to get into that in a sec. I just think something that's super interesting to unpack here is like, I hear from a bunch of people all the time who want to start newsletters. And often it's people who are like in college or just leaving college. And they're in that kind of similar situation of like, they want to do something that's going to make it easier to get into like a career that they want to get into or to like, unlock some doors. And you're a really interesting example of like the, like providing something valuable to people who are already in that industry when you're on the outside and when you don't have anything necessarily yourself yet, which is I think the super hard thing to do because you have all the people like, I mean, Tyler knows like Secret CFO, right? They're on the inside. People are going to read their newsletter because they're sharing stuff for insiders from the inside. And then you have, I think the closest comparison I would say to you is maybe like Harry Stebbings and what he's done, right? Which is like the twist, which is more common and I think a lot easier to do because everyone can do it. I mean, it's very hard to pull off
Totally.
execution wise, but like
Totally.
everyone can go
Totally.
to experts in the space and
Totally.
interview
And
them and do that, right? But there's not many people who've
totally.
done what you've done, which is like provide value from outside.
Totally. And to me, it was all about adding value because that's how I would get people to come back the next week. And so if I could provide a really great company, investors would read it and founders would want their company's future. And I remember sort of when I learned that when Harry Stebbings was, I think like 19 is when he started 20 VC. And I was like, I can do that. And I can do that better because he interviews a bunch of people who have already made it. And so I'll just interview all the people who are on my level. And then when they make it, I'll be right there with them. And so it's funny because Harry became a reader. And obviously I'm still in huge admiration of what he's been able to do from transitioning sort of his media company to sort of like a venture firm. And we're running the same playbook. We're doing it differently, but we're running the same playbook. And when you say like, yeah, it's similar to Harry Stebbings, that's a compliment to me because I admire what he's done. And obviously I think that while slightly different, like he's playing the same sort of game as we are, which I've sort of coined venture media.
Yeah. But I think it's really interesting that like a lot of people, if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, like, could someone come along and build this kind of media business? I would have looked at what Harry had done and gone, okay, when he was doing this, there weren't that many people interviewing VCs from like more of a at least initially from a beginner's point of view, right? So like that was a really interesting thing. Now there are more VCs on podcasts than there are startups to like invest into, right? So that would be like super played out. But the way that you kind of
Totally.
found like a different angle to come in and be like, oh, you can still build this. You just have to like look for something that is not currently like available for everybody, basically.
Yes, and I think one of the things that was at the time I didn't realize it's smart, but we started with the founders who were kind of for even though some of these people were more experienced than I was, they were on my level because they were also just starting. Right. And so I think they took to the fact that I was sort of a founder too. And it was funny because we sort of got in, and it's even funny. We just did a dinner the other night. We had a portfolio company who was talking. He was like, "Yeah, Brett found me when I was a nobody, but he was a nobody too." And he was joking, but he was also serious. Where it's like, "Yeah, we sort of both started at the same level, and we were able to sort of grow together," which I think was a very unique sort of thing that the Bullet Pitch newsletter does. Is that it finds these founders who are at the beginning versus VCs are sort of already established and they already sort of feel this hierarchy. Founders don't feel that because it's just them, right? So I think also sort of lucky with starting with the founders versus venture firms.
Cool. And I guess I know Tyler's itching to get on to talk about like all the other stuff you built on top, like the events and everything. Something I want to talk about a little bit first, just a little bit of newsletter content before we get to that is like, especially with you, with the way that you were building the newsletter initially, where you weren't sure what this was going to turn into. It sounds like there wasn't this sort of like, obviously the plan was to, break into VC, but there wasn't this grand plan necessarily of like, there's going to be a fund on top and everything and yada, yada. If you were to start the same newsletter again today, like what would you do differently in terms of like growth? Like what would your sort of like playbook be to go out and take this from scratch, assuming you know everything, you have the connections and everything, but you're not starting with like a ridiculous amount of money in the bank or anything like that.
You know,
And Brett, to add to that, can you talk about the Twitter hack that you were doing for a while that was working super well to
well,
grow this thing?
I'll go one better. Let me start with how we got our first, call it 10,000 subscribers. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, and that's funny because so Middlebury just came to New York and they did this fun trip called the Fall Finance Trip. And I said this to the group, which they loved it. And I had like 20 kids like just totally hound me afterwards to just talk to me more about this. But at the time I went on this banking trip and I did not like banking. So I was like, how do I do something that's not banking? And so it was fun, sort of full circle moment for them to come to come to us and basically do this. But when I was in school, I learned early on, and I don't know if it was by accident, but I had learned through an internship how to use Apollo, and I understood the power of sort of marketing emails. But again, and this is maybe from a lack of experience that ended up being a benefit to me, but like I thought that marketing emails could be used for anything. So I used Apollo's marketing software. I was paying like, whatever, $300 out of my piggy bank. And I was basically sending marketing emails to venture firms to sign up for the newsletter, right? Hey, and it was like, I think the subject line is something like, discover the hottest companies in venture. And it was like, hi, my name is Brett. I run Bullet Pitch. You should sign up here. And it was free. And I think we sent about 50,000 marketing emails through my .edu. And the best part was that it didn't get blocked because EDUs don't get blocked. So if any college students listen to this podcast, that's a little hack. If you could cold email anyone, your EDU will never get blocked. And so we started getting like these people who were subscribing to the newsletter. And it was because I don't know if they looked at the EDU. I don't know what they looked at, but I guess the subject line was intriguing enough. And the body of the email was intriguing enough where A, we had that, and B, sometimes we would have people be like, hey, actually I'm a founder, but this is really cool. I'd love to be featured. And so we basically scaled the first 10,000 people on this newsletter, literally from just a marketing email stunt that ended up working because it was showing the value that we added. And then it was funny. It's like right before I graduated Middlebury, I got this email from like the back office that was like, hey, we've noticed some unusual activity from your school email. If you're sending marketing emails, please know that's super against the student handbook or whatever and could like greatly affect your like standing at Middlebury. And I sent an email immediately. I was like, oh, like don't worry about it. Like we turned it off. And by that point we had been sort of running Twitter ads for a bit. So that was sort of like how we got there initially. And then sort of the Twitter thing, Tyler, it feels like a lifetime ago, but I think there was this like cool moment where everyone was sort of pulling out of Twitter left and right. I think Musk had just bought it. And there was this really cool, and by everyone pulling out, I mean advertisers, there was this really cool opportunity to basically do a bit of an arbitrage and get subscribers for super cheap by taking a different approach to advertising. and using some of Twitter's beta features. And I credit sort of a buddy of mine who had been running Twitter ads for years for like different, D2C products. And he was like, you should try this for the newsletter. And I remember there was a summer where we were probably doing 1,000 new subscribers a day. Like it was something stupid. And it was fun because then we would like run it through a company like Sparkloop, and we would be able to make some, not all, but some of that money back, which was great because, as a college kid who had no money, that was pretty ideal for me. And I didn't understand what cash flow looked like, and I didn't understand paying on credit. So it was like all those kinds of things that happened at once. But all said and done, like that's probably how we scaled to at least our first 50,000 people on the newsletter.
In the Twitter thing, were you just like arbitraging the cheap ads?
We got really good at sort of ad copy, and we really understood. Like there was this one ad, there were a couple ads.
I did see a lot of bullet pitch ads back in the day.
What I remember is, and we were like, we're doing the whole thing where we were running lookalike audiences. And again, like we got super into the weeds of it. And like Twitter's so hard to, I'm sure you both have tried to run ads on that. Like I was probably spending 5-6 hours a day on this. And switching out the copy and all that stuff. But it got to such a point that I remember there was sort of this moment where it felt like the newsletter industry was copying our ads, where like we would have an ad that looked really cute and nice, and then like someone would take the same exact copy and put their thing in it. And it was the most flattering thing to me because it was like, oh my God, like we're doing this so well that other people are following suit. And so, that was sort of how we scaled. And again, like I didn't know this at the time, but like that scale was everything, not for the reason I thought. And the reason I thought was, oh, good, the more subscribers equals the more advertisers that pay the most amount of dollars. That is not true. And I will pretty much go on record saying that anyone who's trying to build a newsletter business now that purely runs ads based on the amount of subscribers they're dead in the water. This is not how the industry, I believe, should work anymore. But I didn't know any better. So that was my thought. It was like the more subscribers equal the more this. And I think, Tyler, you and I talked about this at a certain point. I was like, yeah, like I'm going to sell this for like $100,000, right? And to me, it was like hilarious because that was the most money I've ever seen in my life. And I was like, that would be so cool if I did that. And obviously, fast forward a couple years, that would be a hilarious joke if I ended up doing that. But anyways, so it was very much about like scale the subscribers for what I thought would be ads. What it turned out that was actually going to be useful for was using it as a top of funnel for everything else we've built on top of this. But that was sort of how I thought about growth. And there was that sort of summers, Tyler, that I think you and I were probably on the phone maybe once or twice a day. It was all about how do I grow this thing super fast, super quick, run ads. I just sort of, it was a very sort of cool moment in time. And it was cool because like we had just built out the brand to the point where I had people actually recognizing the brand, and I just gotten to New York City. And I remember like people coming up to me at like networking events and being like, oh, I read Bullet Pitch. And I was like, you do? Because to me, it was such a foreign concept that like these thousands of people were actually real people and not just a number on a screen.
Those are awesome. Let's assume, because I think this was Louis' original question, and then I butted in. Let's assume those don't work. You got your .edu. We don't want Middlebury taking your degree away. Not that you need it at this point. And Twitter, right, is a shit show. So let's assume that doesn't work. What are you doing? Are you doing anything for growth now? Or are you just kind of living on, hey, people know who we are. They're sending it to the right people. Like, what have you been doing basically from that point where Twitter stopped working to today?
It's a great question. More than ever today, it's a lot of organic. I have pretty much jumped off the Twitter bandwagon. I rarely ever post on Twitter now. I'm all over LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn is the best way.
I see you on LinkedIn constantly.
I think
it is good stuff.
It is the best way. And it's funny. Twitter never really felt like my people. It feels like LinkedIn. It's my Rolodex. Every time I get on a call with someone, I connect with them afterwards. I build relationships with people. LinkedIn feels like an extension of that for me. And so it is the best way for us to grow. We're doing a lot of organic growth. I mean, I'll probably hit a viral post once every 2-ish weeks. And so that obviously funnels a ton of people into the newsletter. And then what's cool is like our events too, right? And we can talk about that, but like we do everything up to like 1,000-person events, right? And of course, a lot of people come from the newsletter, but at the same time, a lot of people see the events, whether I posted it on LinkedIn or someone sharing it around. And once they opt in, they're now also a newsletter subscriber. So it's become very bi-directional. And it's great because the people who want to go to events are like the highest of high quality subscribers for like, one, we have a ton of data on them, if it's a founder, how much they've raised, whatever, if it's an investor, how big their fund is, if it's, potential angel investor. Oh, this is really interesting. You do this. So there's a lot there with the people from events. And so our two probably biggest growth channels today, but again, I don't think of them as growth channels anymore, are events and organic content, which has worked really well. And candidly, like, it's funny, our head of ops asked me the other day, he's like, how come we're not running ads anymore? And it's just because it's not going to really change anything, right? And again, never say never, maybe we will, but like, it's not going to change the trajectory of where the business is going now, because we've established a foundation with this brand. And now we got to focus on all the things that really matter today, which is the investment arm, which is these events, right? All of our sponsors that we work with them with the newsletter, of course, but it's usually events plus newsletter. It's very rarely, although we do, just newsletter, because our events have become such a value add to so many of these sponsors, and they've seen the ROI in the way that they will never see with digital.
Yeah. I think the one of the things that you hit on was, if you're just, if you're kind of running the old school, newsletter playbook, right, where you're just kind of running ads and, kind of selling against that, trying to grow the list, right? Let's call like the 1440 model. It's going to work for scale, right? It's going to be very hard to do that if you never hit, a couple million subscribers. And so I know you mentioned a couple times, like, right, events, you're doing dinners, you started the fund. What was the moment you kind of realized, like, oh, this is more than a newsletter, I need to start doing other things? And then, like, what was the first thing that you kind of kicked off beyond, what was the first thing that made money beyond the newsletter?
Let's start here, right? Like, my belief, and I started seeing this when it was news. It felt like 2 years ago. It was like right when Beehive was like catching fire, and it was newsletter like craze. Everyone wanted to start a newsletter. And I remember being like, I actually, from sort of like the critical investor who I have become, even though we weren't investing yet, is like, I'm this investor who's looking at all these businesses, and I would never back a media company because I understand sort of the nuts and bolts and how it works. But yet every one of these AI newsletters, because they were all coming up like wildfire, who were building an AI product, I thought was fascinating, because they were building a distribution that was going to end up being their first 1,000 customers. And I thought that was genius. But very few people were thinking like that. And I remembered shifting my mindset, and that's, I believe, why this has all worked, being like, oh, wait a second. This isn't a newsletter. This is a top of funnel venture firm. And I'm just building the brand before I actually build the other thing. So I think that was sort of a big moment of realization. I had it early enough on where we weren't built out enough yet, or I had to really pivot anything. It was just like, oh, okay, so I'm going to keep building this, but I'm going to think sort of longer term about this, where it is about the companies we feature in a way that, like, the content's important for a morning brew until the second that they release it, and then it's on to the next. For us, that's not the case. I need to show that I featured 20 of the last companies that have become big hits. Right. And so that was a big piece of it. And then your second question was,
so what was the first thing that you started doing
made money.
that made money besides and what was the rationale behind doing that one?
We did an event in New York for founders and investors to meet. And we've been thinking about this for a while. Founders and investors all want to meet. We happen to have all these founders who are reaching out to us wanting to be featured, but really they just want to meet other investors, right? It's the whole point of Bullet Pitch. Feature your company to get in front of investors. And investors all want to meet founders. So you're like, well, shit, we have such an interesting audience. Specifically, we know we have a large audience in New York. Let's just throw an event and see what happens. And candidly, like, I had never really done anything in New York. I didn't really have a network in New York. And I remember driving down from Vermont and throwing this event, and there was a line around the block. And I was like, oh my God, this is it. This is how it's going to work. One number means nothing on a newsletter, but one person physically present is a whole lot more. And so that was sort of the very natural progression where I was like, okay, we have this audience now. Let's start bringing them together. Let's bring founders and investors together. Let's get deals
Brett,
done.
I wasn't able to make that one. I think my son got sick, but my buddy still talks about that event.
Oh, that was not the first one. So we did like a breakfast, and then I think probably 6 months later, we went from, okay, well, 100-person event worked. Let's try 1,000-person event. And we like rented out the venue. This is the first time I'd ever talked to our sponsors about doing that. They were like interested, and it was like, I've never seen anything like it. It was a line. I don't even think we could pull this off again if we tried. Like, our events are big now, but we're so organized that like we'll never have the classic 2-hour line. And the craziest part was that it was such an engaged group of people that I was so freaked out that none of these people, like, they were all going to hate Bullet Pitch afterwards because they had to wait in this 2-hour line. I came down and I was like giving people like pizza and whatnot. And I remember them being like, we love this. Like, we're all networking in line. This is great. And I was like, holy shit. And I remember, this is the best part. My mom came to this event and she sort of just looked at me and she was like, I don't really understand what you're doing. But like, you know, because I'd been telling my parents, it's like, this is my job. And they were like, what? I was like, this is it. And they were like, go get a job. And after she came to that event, she sort of looked at me and she was like, I don't know what you're doing, but keep doing it. And ever since then, you know, they've always been my biggest advocates, but since then specifically, like, it's been hilarious. Like, my mom will come and she's like, have you thought about this? Or my dad will come and be like, this might be a really interesting idea for your business. And they just completely bought in a way that, like, they were bought in before, but they were like, oh my God, there's something special happening here. And I felt it too.
They were the original seed investors, right?
Yes.
I was going to ask how long you made them wait in line. I'm guessing
No, I brought my mom right in.
right in. Okay.
She didn't want to stay too long though, because it was too crowded for her.
Did you charge for those first events, or were those like sponsor supported events? Or
So even today we don't, right? Like, founders don't have any money. Investors think that they're entitled not to pay for things. If we do investor only events, occasionally we'll have them pay for it, but that's years later when we've proven out how much value these things are. And so people are usually willing to spend $50 on the ticket. But like, for the most part, every dinner we do, everything we do is like you are being invited to this really sort of exclusive space. And I think that was the right approach. And initially it felt like maybe it wasn't, but in the long run it has been.
why do we've seen, like, Corey kind of said the same things for John Wall Street, right? And a bunch of people say this, and I've definitely experienced it myself. Like, why do you think it is that, like, these sponsors, the brands that are sponsoring those events, are willing to put up like a bunch of money to get 100 or 1,000 people in a room, but would not pay anywhere near as much to reach the same 1,000 people plus a couple of whatever tens of thousands more in the newsletter? Like, why do they want to spend so much money on the events rather than the newsletter, I guess?
It's a great question, right? Because if you think about a bank, I'm going to butcher the numbers a little bit, but I'll be close enough where it'll be intriguing. We're like, when a bank gets a customer in who's putting $1 million into an account, they're automatically making $20,000 on that customer, right? It might even be a little bit more, but it's something like that, right? And so if you think about it, in theory, one founder who raises a seed round of $3 million is a $60,000 thing from one thing. And so if you meet that founder at one event, right? If you meet 5 founders, the ROI is huge, right? And so you can very quickly start to see why these banks would shell out an enormous amount of money to pay someone like me to do something like that, right? Here's where it gets interesting. I think it's about intent. When someone's reading a newsletter, and this is my experience as a consumer too, and I often have to go back to this every single time I'm thinking about companies now, is like, as a consumer, do I click on ads? No, I don't, right? And like, maybe something's going to catch my eye, but for the most part, I'm not. But yet, if I were in a room and I met someone really interesting, and obviously I'm in this space where I'm trying to get advertisers, but I watch founders interact with these companies and they don't realize that they need it until they actually realize that they need it. And so to me, we're in a sort of like this attention economy where no one has any attention span anymore. But IRL, you do. And I think that a lot of these brands have gotten really smart and they realize that their best conversion rate always, I mean, it's my best conversion rate, right? Like, I could send a sponsor 1 million emails and tell them how great I am and send them videos and pictures of our vets. If I can get on the phone with them, I know what my close rate is, and it's damn well higher than what it would be if it was just a cold email, right? So I think the IRL thing is everything. And I think that a lot of these brands understand that, which is why they're willing to spend on it.
How much would you say the newsletter translates to people showing up at the event? Like, are you advertising it in the newsletter? Is it just kind of like top of funnel? Like, what percentage would you say of like tickets, acquired are coming from the newsletter?
It's so hard to say because, like, in my mind, it's like, call it 70%. But you have to remember that, like, we're at the point now where, again, it's about attention. I'll send it the founders giving that we're doing next month in the newsletter, which is like an event for founders, Thanksgiving themed. And we'll send that same text blast. As you can probably imagine, we get about 150 signups in 10 minutes from the text blast. And we get about 10 signups in an hour from the newsletter, right? It's the same people. We know they're subscribed. We just happen to have their phone numbers too because they've attended a lot of our events. But what I've found is that what the newsletter really does is it gets people in the door. It gets you their information. And from there, it's how do you use them, right? And so one of the biggest ways we've seen this is converting them into LPs, right? And like, this is what I never understood at the time of running this thing is I was like, CAC, okay, well, if we're acquiring the subscriber for $1 and then like it costs us $1, whatever. What I didn't realize at the time, and actually like, I'm happy I didn't know this because I probably would have tried way less hard, is that every time we got someone who was a subscriber to Bullet Pitch, if they were potential LP, that's tens of thousands, maybe potentially even hundreds of thousands of dollars in the long run. But I would have never have realized that because it wasn't an immediate sort of like instant gratification. So yeah, that's how I think about the newsletter. But it's funny because a founder asked me the other day, or someone asked me the other day, like, what % of the deals do you see come through the newsletter? And it was like, it's hard to say because I don't know where the newsletter ends and where the brand starts, right? Because I've had people who've told me they know Bullet Pitch and they've never read our newsletters and they never come to our events. So the brand has now transcended the newsletter. And that's, I think, kind of the point, right? Like if I sunset the newsletter, it might not make a difference because people are still engaged because we have all their emails, we have all their phone numbers, and eventually they're going to come or participate in the things that we want them to do, which is our events and potentially investing or potentially coming to us with their new hot startup that we want to invest in.
I guess the current newsletter format is still that like sort of highlighting a different startup each week, right? Which is like, it's interesting for anyone who's a founder, but it's not a must read in the sense that it's like, it's not an opportunity for you. It's just something interesting to like kind of a pulse check on the market, right? It's like what other people are doing.
Exactly.
And then
But
for
what we
the
find is-
VC, it's presumably interesting, but it's kind of like, this is what we look at these all day. Like there's, you don't necessarily need to see every single one. It's fine if you miss one, I guess. So yeah,
Totally.
I wonder if there's like if makes the newsletter sort of like if that leads to like the potential for maybe different versions of the newsletter or like something else in like touching base with the audience that's like, is there other content that they need or that they would want potentially that is almost more necessary?
It is possible. And we've thought about this. However, so long as I have a company, and this just happened again, that comes to me through this funnel right now, and I look at that company, I'm like, oh my God, no one knows about you yet. I just found you and I'm about to just blow you up in every sense of the word. I'm going to invest. Then I'm going to go introduce you to every fund I've ever met in my life. This just happened to us 2 weeks ago. I'm sitting at 4 years now running this thing. A company came to me. I go, oh my God, this is one of the best companies truly, and we're investing in them right now, so I'm stoked about this, I've ever seen. The run rate's remarkable for having no institutional funding. They have never really raised any venture dollars. They've raised some friends and family. They are crushing it in their industry. And they just found us because they like reading the newsletter and they like startups. So long as that keeps working, why would I change that? Because at the end of the day, one company has the potential to change the entire trajectory of my business, right? And so for me, as long as this thing keeps pumping me in deals, why would I ever change it? And I think like, could I add things on top of it? You bet we've thought about it. But every single time I go, oh, maybe this format's something like this happens, and I literally look at myself in the mirror and I go, I'm the luckiest motherfucker ever. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that on the podcast, but like, I am so damn lucky because wow, I just got this incredible inbound, and I know that no VC's ever seen this deal. I know that, and this is what happened with our buddy Daniel's company, Tyler. I found him and I go, oh my God, I'm going to go blow this one up. We're going to be the first check-in. And now they like graduate from me and like, we're like nobody on this cap table compared to who's on it now. Right? But this is what we start to do again and again and again. And it's because this media company pumps us in these deals. And I go, whoa, this might be an opportunity. And all of these firms, candidly, you think that they're like really sort of well structured, even the best ones in the world. I've gotten a little sneak peek into what a lot of these firms look like. They have no idea what they're doing. Right? And look, do I? Probably not. But like the difference is that I know I have an engine that's working. And a lot of these firms don't.
Yeah, can you take us through the Bullet Pitch Plus, which I think will take us into the investment arm? And I think you actually had a pretty interesting, I want to call it like a screw up, but right, I think when you launched that, you launched with one model and then you switched it pretty quickly. So we could like walk us through that and then kind of tell us how you developed the investment arm, because right, like I think that's the ultimate goal of building something like this, to your point of being able to put checks into these companies before anyone else and being able to bring them to other folks.
This is what's so interesting. And I'm going to start here because this is something that it's not that I haven't realized this before, but I recently verbalized this and I was like, oh my God, wow. Bullet Pitch Plus is what's called an investment syndicate. The way a syndicate works is the same as a fund. You basically pool a bunch of capital together into what's called an SPV and you invest it, right? So if you have a bunch of people who want to put smaller checks into a deal, you pool all the money together and you invest like you would a fund. It's actually the same model as venture. Only difference is it operates deal by deal versus operating as a fund level, right? So that is what Bullet Pitch Plus is. It's a different company because the media company needs to be separate from 1528, which is what the name of it is. We license out the name, all good there. What's really interesting is that most syndicates that are spun up, all the ones that you see on AngelList and all these big ones, tend to focus on late stage deals. The reason why is because most of these, I don't want to call them non-sophisticated investors because they are sophisticated. You have to be sophisticated. You have to be accredited to participate in ours and any other syndicate ever. But most of these people who have done very well for themselves that aren't as familiar with the venture asset class want to invest based on seeing things that are sort of like shiny, right? So Andreessen's in on the deal. It's an Anthropic round D, Series D. Like this is sort of the stuff that these angel investors are typically attracted to. I don't want to do that. Right. And so we started with the mindset of we're going to find these really early stage companies and back them before all the big guys. What's crazy about that is because we started there and I had never had a track record besides writing a really great newsletter on these companies and saying, look, I wrote on that one. It was really hard to start in the beginning. But what's been cool is as time has progressed with the syndicate, people are like, oh my God, you did Posh, you did Rainmaker, you did like all these deals that are now like crushing for us. We were one of the first ones in, right? I mean, like, the latest deal we've ever done is at a 30 million post-money valuation, which is like a late seed. And like for a syndicate, that's kind of unheard of for the most part because most of these syndicates like to go way later. So that made it very difficult to start it. But at the same time, I had a base of people because I had built this media company that were excited about the deals I were seeing and willing to take a bet on me. And by the way, willing to take a bet on me to an extent. The first two deals I did, and I was joking with someone the other day, like, happen to be some of our best performing deals. I had to front some of the money myself because it was hard to close some of these, right? Because people were like, what the fuck is this guy doing? But I believe so deeply in myself that now, like, hopefully, if these deals continue to go the way they're going, it's going to be like the most hilarious, like, wow, I can't believe that, like, I was struggling and now look at these deals, like I ended up making a lot of money off of them myself. But that's sort of how the trajectory of this has gone. And so over time, and it takes time and venture, we've started to prove out this track record now that this really works, that I am seeing companies before all these big firms who are now looking to me for their next deals because they know I have them. And they're like, Brett, you just tell me what to do and we'll do it. And then, like, within the span that Bullet Pitch Plus has been around for under 2 years, the markups have been absolutely wild. The funds that have invested on top of us, I like off the top of my head, Lair Hippo, Slow Ventures, First Mark, Headline, Long Journey, Goodwater, Bessemer, right? Like these are all firms that, like, if you're a pre-seed fund, you're lucky to get a markup from one of them in 2 years. This has become like a significant thing where it's basically like every 3 months our companies get marked up, properly raised from these big institutionals, and we're just beating them to the game because we've got this media company. So that's sort of been the progression of Bullet Pitch Plus, and it's been amazing because I've now been able to solidify myself, which has been the goal the entire time. Once I realized that, like, I wasn't just breaking into venture, but I could actually just break the venture model. It's been really cool because now I've been able to finally be like, okay, well, I built this. I told you I could do this. Now I've done this. See, it works. And am I a good picker? I'd like to think I am. But what I'm really good at is using the engine that I've already built to go and find the best deals.
And I think at the beginning, were you, I remember going back and forth on this with you. We were talking about it. And I think I actually recommend charging
the model,
for it.
the model.
Yeah, the model for Bullet
So at
Pitch
the
Plus.
time, Bullet Pitch, the media company, was still in a position where, like, it was okay. We had not hit our stride yet. And obviously, you know, I feel like today, I'm not even going to say we've hit our stride, but like, I have a head of ops. We have people that work for, so like, it's gotten to a point. We have an office. So like,
But
it's
I
gotten
think
to
to
a
your
point
point,
where
right? The money is tied up elsewhere, right? There's a lot of chips on the table, but you know, you
for
can't
sure.
cash
But
them in right now.
when the media company was first starting, it was sort of like it was debatable if this was going to be more of a lifestyle thing on the side or this could be my full-time job. And because of when I launched the syndicate, which I'm so grateful for when we launched it, but at the time was it premature? Maybe because the media company wasn't well stood up enough yet. I wanted to launch it where I charged people to be part of the syndicate. And what I quickly learned was that, and it makes total sense, why would an angel investor pay for something that they don't know they're getting, right? Like, how do you know if my deals are good? Now maybe I could do it, but at the time it's like, okay, well, I'm going to show you guys all these deals and discount your carry, but like, why would you pay a subscription for something that you don't know what you're getting, right? It makes complete sense if you actually think about it from sort of a marketing or business standpoint. So, all in all, right, it was a great learning experience. And I remember like we launched a syndicate. I had a couple people sign up and pay for it. I was literally like, holy shit, I have to pivot this immediately because we were doing our first 2 deals. We pivoted it. We had enough people sign up where we were able to sort of like get the first 2 deals done. And then it's been sort of off to the races ever since. And, it was a great lesson learned, but it was one of those things where I remember I was with a friend and like, I remember her being with me. She was like, are you okay? And I was like, not okay. Cause I was like, oh my God, I think I just blew up this entire thing. Turns out that wasn't the case. I just had to sort of be patient and pivot it a little bit, but it ended up working out. And it's true. Investors don't want to pay for deal flow, but they'll pay to get in good deals. And that's what we're doing.
Awesome. And can you tell us a little bit, kind of what you're doing with creators now? Because I feel like it's coming a little bit full circle with media, right? You're almost kind of getting away from that, but now it feels like you're getting kind of back into that and using a different type of media, maybe.
Yeah. So I've always been bullish on media, right? I mean, even like the LinkedIn content, the amount of founders I get on the phone with, and I'm like, where did you find a bullet pitch? You're like, I resonated with your content on LinkedIn about how founders make terrible employees. I was like, okay, sweet. So this is working. So I've never, ever deviated from media being the top of funnel. Where I will say is that I don't believe that media necessarily can stand alone. I think that you have to build something underneath it, which I truly believe, which is why you're starting to see all these massive tech companies and even some of these venture firms who are trying to build the other way now because they understand how important media is. So that's a point there. But I think where things got really interesting was if you think about content creators, we're just starting to see a shift where someone like Alex Earl made a ton of money on Poppy because she wasn't just an influencer for them, but she was an investor, right? I think she had a little bit of like equity, sweat equity. I think she actually invested some of her own capital into the deal. She made a lot of money when they exited to Pepsi. What's so interesting is that these creators have always sort of been on the side of do a brand deal, make a lot of money, go do the next one. But they have short lifespans, some of them. And the reality is that they're actually not getting the upside, a lot of these businesses that they're actually helping push forward. Specifically, though, they're also working with a lot of businesses that tend to be later stage. At the same time, with this AI boom, we are starting to see all of these founders that have no differentiation in product anymore because it's really hard to, right? And like, this is a thing in CPG years ago where it's like, how do you differentiate a CPG product? Distribution and brand. How do you differentiate a SaaS product now? I would argue it's very similar, right? And like, is there a scenario where someone's building this out of this world tech? Bet. But I think for the most part now, SaaS has become commoditized for the most part. And it doesn't mean it's not good. It's just how do you differentiate? And the answer is distribution. And so if you think about the two-sided problem, all of these creators want access to really hot deals so that they can actually start putting their own potentially hard-earned capital, which they make a lot of, into deals and have upside in some of these deals. But then you have some of these like companies who desperately want distribution but don't know where to get it. There's this really interesting marriage where as the sort of media venture guy, I can come in and be like, well, wait a second. I have access to the deals. I'm sort of in the content like I don't have a huge following. We have a decent following on the newsletter, but I got enough of a following where if I bring the right people in, we also are sort of on the creator side. What if we just fuse these two worlds together and start having these creators de-risk the investments that we're making by investing in our deals? Well, how do we do that? Let's build another top of funnel for this. And so in addition to, we brought in a venture partner who is a creator, but in addition to sort of like the obvious of let's just go get content creators and tell them about the deals we're doing, let's go build this top of funnel where we launch a series where we have 4 founders pitch to a bunch of content creators. And the actual purpose of that series, besides obviously being another revenue generating event for us, is all these creators are going to walk away. And this has happened every single time we've hosted this now, being like, how do I invest in all the companies there tonight? And so we say, well, some of these maybe, but when we have our next deal, we're going to send this over to you. And so a lot of them are starting to do our deals now. We're starting to see posts that they're doing for these companies, and it's making a difference, whether it's getting them customers, whether it's getting these companies investor interest, right? Because some of these firms now are like, well, shit, I would rather go for the company that has distribution. Well, we're the ones who are giving them distribution, right? And so again, we've sort of found another way to differentiate ourselves where we've done such a good job getting deal flow from our media company. Let's go give all the companies that we invest in distribution too.
I love that. That's like a great bookends of like probably the least sexiest media you can do to, probably the sexiest thing there is right now. This has been awesome, man. Do you have anything else for him, Louis?
I guess one thing I always would like to ask is like, you sort of came into the newsletter space. You've done that thing I think that a bunch of successful newsletter operators do, which is sort of gravitate away from calling yourself a newsletter into a media business, into something that has a media arm with a newsletter in there as a sort of a top funnel. If you were to go back and start again with a newsletter, what would you do differently, or like what's sort of your like take on where maybe like how relevant newsletters are today and like what the opportunity is with a newsletter if you were a beginner starting out with one today?
They're super relevant, right? Because at the end of the day, newsletters have this one thing, and this is why email's never going to go away. Even I believe so deeply in text messaging now, and we're seeing the rise of RCS and WhatsApp. You own your own audience, and that is everything. However, I think it's funny because like the only difference I think I would have done in building this is have it, and again, hindsight 2020, you only know what you know now from the beginning. And that was like, if I knew what this was going to turn into, I probably would have from the start been like, okay, Brett, forget that, like, I think our first sponsorship we ever got of the newsletter was like $500. Like, look, great to have, but like at the end of the day, I remember being so stressed about how many clicks it got. At the end of the day, I probably wouldn't have focused as much on that because I would have known that the newsletter was a medium to something greater. And I think like it's funny because every time I talk to specifically, it's any founder, but I had a CPG founder ask me the other day, and he's like really interested in building this business. I think it's a really smart business to build. I think there's totally a ton of space to build this business. But he said to me, he's like, yeah, I want to start going to farmers markets and this and that and incorporating. And go, don't do that. He goes, what do you mean? I go, build the products around butter. I go, build a butter distribution. Go find 500,000 people who are obsessed with butter as you are. And then basically once you have that distribution, this works in anything, candy bars, granola bars, even like SaaS, right? Like, I don't know, health and fitness. Go build the most insane list of people, and whether that's newsletters, whether that's TikTok, but realistically, TikTok gets views. You should be funneling them as a CTA every single time to a newsletter. Go build this audience that's obsessed with a concept, the same concept that you're trying to build into, and then go launch a product. And so I would say that media, I'm probably one of the biggest advocates for this, is never going to go away. Newsletters are never going to go away. But I think how you use them is changing. And I think it's so important now to think that through rather than just assume that because you have an audience, you can run ads against it. Sometimes ads are actually detrimental to the big business. And like, again, would have I done it any differently? No, because it ended up getting me to where I needed to be. But like, would have I stressed over the $500 ad when I didn't have 10 subscribers, but let's call it 100? No, because it didn't actually matter in the grand scheme of things. And I think I was so focused on generating revenue from this thing because I had something that I wasn't thinking as long-term about it. So that's sort of what my, advice would be to anyone who's thinking about a business now. Build a distribution, use a newsletter to do it, but don't think of your newsletter as the business. Use it as sort of the funnel to get to everything else.
Well, I can't think of a better place to end. I think that was perfect way to wrap it up. Brett, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can everybody find you? We want to read some of this LinkedIn porn that you're putting out.
Yeah, for sure. It's Brett Perlmutter on LinkedIn. You can probably find the Bullet Pitch LinkedIn page too. That's starting to grow pretty quickly. You can subscribe to Bullet Pitch, bulletpitch.com, or just the subscribe part's right on the homepage. And if you're a founder building something or you're an angel investor looking to sort of expand, happy reach out to me, DM me. I'm chronically online because that's the business I'm in. And yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, man. I will say I miss the bulletpitch.xyz.
I don't. By the way,
that was the original.
That's a great story, by the way. Not to like prolong the podcast here, but Alexis, who's sitting across from me right now, our head of ops, he emailed the person on like the domain, whatever, where you get the domains, and the person wanted like 50 grand for it. bulletpitch.com, and he said that he was a college kid, which was not a lie. He was in college at the time, doing a project, and it would help him get an A, and the guy ended up giving it to him for $500.
That's awesome. That's being scrappy and,
Oh.
and using that .edu.
For sure.
Awesome, man. Well, that's a great place to end it. I appreciate you joining us, and best of luck. Not that you need it because you're already crushing it.
I appreciate it.
We'll talk to you guys later.